I don't know if you guys have family friends. Does anyone have you have family friends? And when there's a closeness with your family friends, there are some things that you're just not afraid to ask your family friends because of the closeness that you feel. And if there's kind of a level too, right? If you've got a pulse, I'll ask you to help me move, and then it just kind of gets more whatever beyond that. And we had some neighbors, and our friend was a police officer in Springfield, Missouri. And I remember when I got my first ticket. And I know you guys are looking at me with judgmental eyes because you've never gotten a ticket. And I know who you are. But here's what I would just say to you. You speed, you just haven't gotten caught. Okay? So you can look at me all judgmental all you want. I got my first ticket. It was right by Hillcrest. I was going to a friend's house when I was in college. And I remember it was a speed trap, it was 50, but there was one spot where it was 30, and I was going 50, and I got pulled over, and your first ticket, I've had many since then, but the first one you get, you're like, oh man, this is the worst thing ever, you're kind of embarrassed, and you don't know what to do, and you're like, how do I get out of this without my insurance? Because you just think your insurance is gonna go up $800 a day, because you just don't know how it works, it's your first one. And we had a family friend who was a police officer in Springfield. It's first call I make is my dad, because I'm not going to call him and ask him because I don't know him that well. But my dad, I said, hey, Dad, can you call Tim and see if he can get me out of this ticket that I got? Because we were close. He was our neighbor. We celebrated Christmas together. It was totally a reasonable ask. So my dad's like, yeah, let me see what I can do. And I remember he called Tim. And Tim said what he probably says to everybody in that circumstance, which is, they just filed it, there's nothing I can do. And so that's what he said. But there are just some things, you're not afraid to ask your friends because there's a closeness, you're like, hey, I'll ask you to do this, I'll ask you to be part of this. And the miracle that we're going to look at in in John's gospel this morning is a miracle that involves friends of Jesus asking Jesus to do something that only he can do. And it is quite the miracle. We'll start in John's gospel, John chapter 11. And we'll start in verse 1. And we'll skip a few verses just because it's a narrative, but we'll make sure to get the gist. So chapter 11, verse 1, it says this. It says, now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. Now that's interesting, verse 2 there. It's interesting because this is chapter 11 in John's gospel. Mary does this in chapter 12. So it's kind of interesting that John puts this right here. And the reason why he does is because John's gospel was the last one that was written. And so what a lot of people think, a lot of commentators think, is that John is just referring to common knowledge that would have been from the synoptic gospels, and he hasn't told that part of his story yet. So I don't know, I just think that's interesting. So the sister sent to him saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Now, this is quite the circumstance. It's quite the situation here. You have Jesus off doing ministry, healing people, teaching, doing his thing. And then his friends reach out to him and they say, hey, this guy, your friend Lazarus is sick. Is there something that you can do to help him? And what I find just so interesting maybe about this text and about this circumstance is that, this is Jesus living his life. And he experiences something that we all experience from time to time. I mean, you just kind of live in your life doing things like you normally would do, and then you get news that something bad happened. I mean, has that ever happened? You kind of go, and I think of this week at the church. I think we got 3 or 4 calls. They're just wow, this has been a heavy week. And so Jesus is just like living his life, doing his thing, and he gets this news. And what I like about this is it shows us, like with Jesus, that he's able to connect with us in a way that only he can, because he knows what we go through. That if you've had that moment where you've been caught off guard by bad news, like that is exactly what is happening here with Jesus. And so in those moments where we're caught off guard by bad news and we talk to Jesus about the bad news that's caught us off guard, we know because of stories like this one that he understands. That he understands how we feel, that he probably felt a lot of the same things that we feel in that moment. But the other thing that we see here, and I'm telling the story's going to end, Lazarus is going to die. And we oftentimes we look at the circumstances in our life where things don't go according to plan, and we think, because these circumstances are frustrating, because these circumstances aren't what I would have signed up for, because this thing had to happen this way, it must mean that God is mad at me. It must mean that God doesn't care, because if he cared, this wouldn't have come. But if you look at the verse, it says, in verse 5, Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. That our circumstances, whether good or they don't reveal how God feels about us. And so we see this happens. And so Jesus gets this news. He hears that his friend Lazarus is going to die. And then he waits 2 days, which is, again, interesting. And we'll look at why he waits at the end of the story. And it says that he waited because he loved them. And we'll see how this showed that he loved them. But he waits, and then him and his disciples, they decide, okay, we're going to go. We're going to go to Jerusalem. And as they're going to Jerusalem, they have this conversation. And the conversation is essentially, the disciples are like, Jesus, you can't do that. Jesus, if you go back to Jerusalem, they're going to kill you. If you go back on that, like, we need to stay away if you want to stay alive. And what Jesus says to them is like, well, I'm going to work during the day and no one's going to kill me during the day. And so he goes back. 2 days' journey from where he's at. And he's greeted by one of Lazarus' sisters. And she says probably what you think you would say to Jesus if that happened to you. Verse 17. It says, now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. So Jesus gets news that he's sick, and then Lazarus would have died sometime right after he got news. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning her brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went in and met him. But Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And then in verse 27, she said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. This text is so rich. I mean, you look at verses 21 and 22, and it kind of reads like an Old Testament psalm. That you have Jesus come on the scene, and Martha says to him, if you would have come sooner, my brother wouldn't have died. But I trust you anyways. Lord, if you would have come sooner, but I trust you. I know that you're going to be okay. And what she's saying, she's looking at her circumstances, and she's saying, Jesus, I wish they were different. This is not what I would have chosen. I really wish Lazarus was still here. I know that you have the power to do something about it, but even though he has died, I still trust you. Man, have you ever been there? Have you read a moment in your life where you look around and you're like, this is not what I want. This is not what I signed up for. As a matter of fact, I'm very frustrated at the fact that I'm having to do this, but I'm going to trust you anyways. I would imagine even as we're calling this series, All I Need is a Miracle. And if that title is resonating in your heart, the idea of needing a miracle, of wanting God to do something miraculous in your life, if it's resonating with you, it's probably resonating because there's probably something in your life that you're looking at the same way that Martha's looking at the situation with her brother. You're looking at your life and you're thinking, Jesus, if you would have just come sooner, my marriage wouldn't have gotten to this point. You think, Jesus, if you would have just come sooner, my kid wouldn't have fallen off the deep end. That Jesus, if you would have just come sooner, this sickness wouldn't have progressed like it did. Jesus, if you would have just come sooner, my job situation would have worked itself out. But instead, we're looking at a circumstance where all you need God to do is a miracle. And what we see from Jesus here is we see that feeling that way, vocalizing that, is perfectly fine. That there's nothing about telling God what is on your heart that bothers him. He doesn't rebuke her. He doesn't do anything. In fact, what he does is he says some statements that you really have to deal with. And when you look at the heart of this passage, the beauty of the heart of this passage is that it brings us all to a place where we have to make a decision with what we're going to do with Jesus. Because you can't relegate him to somewhere in the middle if he's going to say things like he says to Martha when she complains about her brother dying. I mean, look at what he says here in verse 25. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he dies, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. He says, do you believe this? You can't say things like this and be just a good teacher. Like what people will do with Jesus is they'll say, he taught a lot about love, and I like his teaching, but I don't know that I would say that he's God. I think somewhere in the middle. And the problem is that because he said things like this, you're forced to say, okay, he's either the Lord or he's a liar or he's a lunatic. Like you got to figure out, what do you do with this person? And I would like, what would you do if I said something like that? Like if you don't think it's crazy, like if I came in here and I said those things, like you'd be like, wait a second, we're going to go. But look at what he's saying. Colin Kruse in his commentary on this, he really says like, Jesus is saying three things very like godlike here. One, he's saying here, and he's saying that I'm the resurrection and the life. He's saying, I have access to special powers that you don't have access to. He's saying, I have access to these special powers of resurrection life, and I can bestow them on anybody that I want. It's pretty bold. He says, and then if you believe in me, even though you die, you will be raised again on the last day. Like that is something that a good teacher can't just say. And then he also says, like, if you believe in me, you'll never die. Like, you have to do something with someone who says things like that. And so he forces her hand, and the crazy thing is, so he gives, like Martha, she comes and she complains about the fact that Jesus didn't show up sooner. Jesus responds by giving her a sermon and putting her on the spot. He's like, do you believe in this? Which, remember, she just lost her brother. Like she's processing the fact that she's never going to see her brother again. At least that's what she thinks. And Jesus gives her some doctrine and puts her on the spot. And here's what we know about it, because we know the story, is that for her it worked. That for her, in that moment, that's exactly what she needed. And we know that because we see the next verse. Look at this in verse 27. She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God who is coming into the world." Which is an incredible statement. That Peter says something similar in Matthew chapter 16, where they're kind of like, Jesus and the disciples are sitting around, and he's like, "So who do people say that I am?" And Peter, because he doesn't think before he talks, but he gets this one right, pipes up and he says, you're the Son of God. That you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus looks at Peter, and really his statement isn't that different than Martha's. And he says, you're right. And on that statement, on that thing that you said, I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell won't overcome it. And you have Martha in this moment where she's processing the loss of her brother, say essentially the same thing. And what we know that's exactly what she needed. So you have Martha process this, and then Mary comes, because he had two sisters. And it's interesting how he addresses her. Look at this here. Now Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him. She fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." That is the exact same thing that her sister said. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." Verse 35, Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying?" Isn't this what people do to Jesus? They look at him and how he does things, and they think, there's a group of people that see him respond emotionally, and they think, wow, he loved him. And then there are a group of people who look at it and they say, why didn't he do something? Like, people don't know what to do with Jesus. But what I find so interesting here is that you have Jesus, just a few verses earlier, make a really bold claim to his deity. I mean, he's saying, if you believe in me, even though you die, you're going to live forever. He's saying, yeah, I'm the resurrection and the life. I have access to these special powers. And then just a few verses later, you have him weeping with people who are in pain. And I know that this is a church, a Christian church, and so we're familiar with the idea of Jesus being God and him being fully man and fully God. But I mean, just kind of think about what you think about when you think of God. You think of something or someone that is so far beyond us, that they don't feel pain like we do, that they're so removed and aloof to the things that we face, that they wouldn't really care. And yet you have Jesus in this moment show us that he truly cares for people, and he has all of this power available to him. And if that's not compelling, I would just say, obviously this is a compelling thing to wrap your mind around, because consider the message of politicians. I mean, now is the time, right, where we're going to get lambasted with political ads, and what are they all going to say? Well, as they're building their case, they're going to say, I am a person with power who sympathizes with the needs of common folk, right? And if you're here and you're political and you got opinions, the one that you get behind is the one where you believe that to be true, right? Like, I got behind this person because unlike everyone else, this one means it. Like, that's what we say, right? Could you imagine them running on a different premise? Like, how weird would it be if a politician was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to tell you everything you want to hear so you'll vote for me, and then I'm going to forget about you, but here's my promise. When it comes time for re-election, I'll tell you everything that you need to hear so that you'll vote for me again. It'd be true, but it would be like it wouldn't be a really good message. And here you have Jesus, who's fully God, saying, I'm compassionate. He's saying, I feel the things that you feel. So what that means is that in those moments in your life where you want the miracle, where you want to see God do something, he doesn't look at your circumstance that is breaking your heart. He doesn't look at it without compassion, but he feels the things that you feel. That here in this moment, where this woman doesn't know what to do, her brother just died, and all she can do is cry and throw herself at his feet, is he weeps with her. And in those moments in your life where you don't know what to say to God, but all you know to do is to cry, he cries with you too. He feels what you feel too. He sympathizes with your pain the same way that he sympathizes with theirs. But it's so interesting to me if you consider the text. Mary and Martha say the exact same thing to Jesus. They both say when they come to Jesus, Lord, if you'd been here, our brother wouldn't have died. And they both get a different response. They say the same thing, but the response they get from Jesus is different. Martha gets a sermon, and Mary gets tears. And what Tim Keller talks about in his book, Encounters with Jesus, where he talks about this text in particular, he talks about how this shows us that God knows what we need when we need it. There are moments in your life where what you need from God is you need the ministry of truth. That you need to be slapped. You need it, and like that's what happens, and he knows when that's what you need. But then there are also moments in your life where you need someone to just put their arm around you and cry, and the beauty of Jesus is that he knows what you need in the moments where you need him the most. Which should give us a lot of confidence as we approach him in the moments where all we need is that miracle. He knows what we need. And so we're calling this series, All I Need is a Miracle, but up to this point, all we have is two sad sisters, right? But then in verse 38, we see why this is one of the miracles. Verse 38, it says, Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, Take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. It's a very practical sentence if you think about it. And Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you? Like, this is like, he's just like, I can be direct with Martha. Like, he's like, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you'd see the glory of God? Like, Mary's off crying somewhere, and he's like yelling at Martha. So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around that they may believe that you sent me. When he said these things, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, Unbind him, let him go. Like, that is a miracle, my friends. Like, that is something. And if you remember early on, Jesus said, I'm going to wait 2 more days because I love them. If you go back to I think it was verse 6 where he said that. Why? Why was that a picture of his love? Well, 1, 4 days is a greater miracle than 2. Like, he just did it, like 4 days, it's a greater miracle. The other reason why it's a picture of his love is because, and I think it's probably because they weren't always good at determining if someone was dead or not in the first century, but there was this belief that for the first 2 or 3 days, that the spirit of the deceased person would hover over them for about 2 or 3 days, and sometimes there'd be a resuscitation that would happen. And so what Jesus did is he wanted to make sure he was dead because he wanted them to experience a true miracle that was undeniable. He didn't want anyone to be able to point to what happened with Lazarus and say, yep, it was a resuscitation, just like no, this was a miracle. And it's because when a human body dies, like it starts changing almost immediately. Almost immediately, like cell membranes start bursting, and there becomes like a sheen to your skin. That your skin actually starts to detach from the muscles. That after about 3 or 4 days, that your body becomes bloated to almost double its size because there's nowhere for the gases to go. That not only that, and when Martha said there was an odor, it's because there is an odor. That if you leave a body in one place for a long time, even after it's still there after it's gone. And so for Jesus to step in and to say to Lazarus, wake up, he stopped all of that from happening and he restored it immediately. Like, think of what that must have been like. Like what he did it because he wanted them to experience that. They have a brother who was dead for 4 days, who Jesus completely brought back to life. And though the miracle is really cool, I love it, it's not my favorite part. My favorite part of this text is the first, in verse 38, where it says Jesus was deeply moved. Like that is my favorite part. But in the Greek, the original idea actually is this idea that Jesus was billowing with anger in this moment. And it makes you wonder, like, what is he mad at? You don't really get the impression that he's mad at the family. I mean, he seemed to be pretty cool, and we know that he ends up healing Lazarus. So what is it that what's making him billow with anger? And I think the answer is pretty clear. Death. He's ticked off at death because he's sitting here looking at his friends, grasping this reality that someone they love is gone. And if you've ever lost someone that you loved, it broke your, right? There are parts of that where you have to come to terms with the fact that you'll never see them again. And let's be honest, like the challenge of that moment isn't just the moment when they're gone, that everything leading up to it is horrible. You lose hope. There are situations where people die and it completely catches us off guard. And what Jesus is doing is he's looking at this. He's looking at a lifetime, all of creation, dealing with death, and it makes him angry because we were never made to die. And I love it because as we consider the pain that death has caused us in our lives, it brings me great joy to know that it made him mad too. When I think of all the times I've said goodbye to someone that I love, it brings me great joy to know that frustrated him just like it frustrated me. And though there might always be a feeling of, Jesus, if you would have come sooner, it wouldn't have happened, we know that we can trust him when it comes. But as I close this morning, that we cannot ignore from this text that what him healing Lazarus cost him. Tim Keller says that he actually, in bringing Lazarus out of the grave, he himself walked into it. And we know that's true because of what John says in chapter 11, verse 53, where it says, this is the same text, it says, so from that day forward, they made plans to put him to death. That Jesus knew this is how they were going to respond. Jesus knew this is what would happen when he raised Lazarus from the dead, but he did it anyways. And when you think about all the good things that we have in the gospel, all the hope that we get to experience from Jesus, that we get all of it because he was willing to walk into the grave that everything that's made available to us, this hope of a resurrection, that it is truly ours because he walked out into the grave so that we could walk out. And what this text shows us, it shows us all kinds of stuff. It shows us his power over death. It shows us how he bestows life, but it also shows us that he knows exactly what we need. He knew that you talk to Mary different than you talk to Martha. He knew ultimately what we need is we needed him to go into the grave, and he did it so that we could have life. And so really our response to texts like this, it's not only to thank God for what he has done and what he can do, but it's also just to create a sense of awe in our hearts when we consider the work of Christ and what he was willing to spend for us. Would you pray with me this morning? Heavenly Father, I come to you, God, thankful that you know exactly what we need. Thankful that we can trust in you and be confident that you give us life. And so, God, as I come to you this morning, I'm thankful for the paradox that is, you are fully divine. So as we have things in our lives we want to see you do, you are fully divine, that you can handle those situations, that God, you can work miraculously. But God, I'm also thankful because we see clearly in this text that while you are divine, you are also just like us. That you weep when you feel pain. That you care about the things that bother us. And so, Jesus, our response to this text is that we worship you. And God, I pray that if there's anyone here this morning who doesn't know you, that God, by the power of your Spirit, God, that you'd make them aware of that fact. That God, if they need to respond and put their faith in you, then Jesus, I pray that God, in this moment, you would speak to their hearts and let them know what they need to do. God, that they would confess their sins to you. They would say, Jesus, I'm a sinner. Please forgive me. And that, God, that they would put their hope in what you did for them on the cross. That they would trust that because of what was done there, that you have made a way for them to go to heaven. That you've made a way for them to experience life and life to the fullest. Jesus, we love you. And Jesus, we trust you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Amen. Love you guys.